Welcome to The Digital Patient, where we discuss the latest advancements in digital patient engagement and share stories from the front lines. I'm your host, Alan Sardana, and with me as always is CMOS MD CEO, Dr. Joshua Liu. Today, we're joined by our very special guest, Michael Mainiero. Mr. Mainiero has over 25 years of experience, 22 of which were focused on digital health. Michael is currently the Chief Digital Information Officer at Cathartic Health. Before joining Cathartic Health as Senior Vice President and Chief Digital Information Officer, he spent 20 years at NYU Langone, overseeing the digital transformation of its academic medical center. At NYU Langone, he established an agile culture of technology and informatics-driven innovation, managed large-scale implementations, and formed dynamic and high-performing teams. Michael co-led a design thinking lab at NYU that developed several products across research, patient care, and education. In his leadership role, he led the transformation of IT, which was critical to all of the missions of academic medicine. Notable achievements include the creation of the state-of-the-art patient portal with an online scheduling system, a physician finder application, a robust patient communications platform, a digital inpatient experience, leading the transformation of telehealth and the modernization of inpatient and ambulatory care sites. At NYU, Michael co-led and coached over 15 agile teams that consisted of designers, product managers, data scientists, software developers, and cyber ops. In the mid-90s, Michael led several startups, notably an online auction website, and built an EHR from the ground up, which was actively used in physician practices across New York City. Michael's expertise is in leadership, user experience, design thinking, software development, agile, and product management. Mr. Mainiero holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the State University of New York at Oswego. He resides in Westchester, New York with his wife and 3 children. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan.
Well, it's amazing to have you on today. You've been deeply immersed in healthcare for over 2 decades now, and in the scientific field practically from birth, as far as my research tells me. I was curious to start the conversation, like who or what were the major influences for you growing up to really solidify this interest in science?
Good question. So I think where you wind up, you kind of fall into it, right? So I think as far as influencers early on, my dad was a huge influence on me. He was a biology teacher, and I think he taught for something like 38 years. So everything we did, it was always about biology, the science of things, evolution. That's ingrained in your formative brain. And I think later on, which we became a massive influencer for me in my experience design was my dad was hit by a car, quadriplegic for 30 years. And in my formative years, I spent a lot of time at the bedside, right? Dealing with, I'd say, the not so good and the gritty world of healthcare for long-term patients, and then later on home care. So for me, I kind of used all of that science, that maybe childhood trauma for what I'd say is rocket fuel for entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
So you did your, I guess, degree in biology, Michael, and had this significant experience with your father that shaped your views. I think getting into healthcare maybe. When you got out of school, it sounds like your first gig was having your own company where you were an independent contractor building software for other companies. Starting from biology and somehow ending up in tech, what sort of made that connection for you?
Well, I think, immediately I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I enrolled at NYU for graduate school in biology. And I was working at UBS in their graphic department as sort of a contractor. And the timing of it was, mid-late 90s. And that's the dotcom boom. If you knew anything about technology, you could have a boat and a plane, it was that real crazy boom period. And of course, I grew up in New York. So, messaging from friends, hey, do you know anything about HTML or databases? So, really didn't have a lot of money working in the city, so I was hungry and, not hungry for food, but hungry for really making some money. So I hit the ground with, dozens of little projects here and there, databases and whatnot. And I think really the first one that hit was a good friend of mine worked on the commodities exchange, and they wanted to build a online auction site. It was not eBay. That would have been a different story we'd have to tell. But that's where I learned how to, I cut my teeth. I learned how to do software development. Really took to front end software. We didn't call it that back then, but I was doing the user experience design and front end code and loved it. And that was mildly successful. And then later on, after that, actually, when that was sold, another friend, I guess I'll tell the story. I was getting my hair cut. I'm bald on this Zoom, but I had hair, and I turned around and a guy I went to high school with said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I just left this company." And this was New York in the 90s. "Oh, I'm recruiting for a company that's building an electronic health record system.
Wow.
You want to come interview?" There I was. I became the creative director and heading up the product and doing a lot of the front end code. And that was along the way, had to make ends meet. So if anyone needed something, I would show up to their company and give them a consult, maybe build a database, and really, I think, really tempered my customer service and literally running around subways, taking cabs to different places. So it was a wild ride. And then dotcom burst in '99, maybe 2000, and there I was on the street, and that's when NYU Langone picked me up.
I think
I love that scrappiness in your story, Michael. And it sounds like you were very much self-taught when it came from a software development point. Is that fair to say? Like you were just like looking at stuff online?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think two ways. I think one was I had great friends that would sit next to me and help me and were patient enough to show me how to do it. Right. So they would, I think when I first started at the first startup, it was like a team activity. "Oh, try this, Michael, build this database, do this." So I learned, by actually doing, but also if you remember back then, Barnes and Nobles, you'd spend hours and hours and, pouring through books. And I would take on jobs, consulting jobs to build a website or an app and maybe not know how to do it when I took the job on, but it would take me 40 hours to do something that later on I could do in 30 minutes. So I'd get paid for basically learning. And, when you're hungry, living in Brooklyn, trying to make rent, you'll do anything.
No, that's awesome. And I love the fact that, you in a way came back to your roots of like combining now science with with technology and digital. During your 20 plus years at NYU, you were instrumental in leading the development of several epic integrated innovations. Like you mentioned that the co-led the EHR development, but NYU Langone's health app. You had inpatient MyWalls that you were a part of, the multimodal COVID-19 effort that you built out basically to track employee symptoms to make sure it was safe to work. And I think if I recall, like that was set up in 24 hours. Like you were an agile team, you were working hard at everything. At least the prototype was 24 hours. But what's really fascinating to me is how all of these innovations played so nicely within the ecosystem that you had built and really supported the NYU's broader Epic instance. I'm curious, what innovations were you most proud of during your time back then, and how did that knowledge really propel you to where you are today and where you're going tomorrow?
Yes, I think just a couple of things. I think as far as the ability to innovate, I think, NYU has a very strong CIO, this guy Nader. He was instrumental in foundational build. So having that foundation in place with Epic and really the trust in our teams to sort of experiment and say, "Hey, we're going to do this in Amazon." That doesn't happen a lot in healthcare. So I think, to the 24-hour turnaround, that was literally having that ready infrastructure in place, so we didn't have to start from zero. But I think to the question of what I liked the most out of that, I think really I was most proud of the Find a Doctor. It's like an 18-year love affair of failing forward. There was a lot of criticism in getting it right. You have to deal with not just what the patient needs, but also what the practice and physician needs. And I don't think anyone really got it right. And we did see a lot of people copying us over the years, but I think that was something to be proud of, because until we saw the numbers, until we saw it actually working and got feedback, it was a struggle to get it right and really temper our product development. And then I think the bedside stuff goes back to my experience with my dad in the hospital, just making it a better experience for the patient. that, I think one of the things that we don't see in digital health and software is you don't meet your users. So that's kind of like this intangible thing. And I got to round and see people using the system, and it really inspired and changed me, because if I just sat, at my desk and gave PowerPoints about this thing we were building, and I never got to see a kid use the TV, or have an interaction on screen with a doctor, that moved me and that propelled me. That's kind of the fuel I needed to be proud and interested in continuing that.
But can I ask you, how do you think about building that sort of empathy for the patient experience or even the provider experience as you build out your digital transformation strategy? Like, for example, do you end up having your team members spend a certain amount of time each week or month or quarter on the wards, meeting patients, seeing them interact? Or how do you build that empathy into how you lead your team?
That's a great question. I think a couple of things. When you look at empathy-based design, if you study Lean Sigma, they've got I can't remember the name of the word, but when you do a walkabout, you can't just do it from afar. And the good news about where I am now with Catholic Health is there's a lot of, I'd say almost like a third of the team here were nurses or clinicians, and we're spending time at shadowing. And so if someone comes along and says, hey, I want to do this thing, one of my first questions is going to say, did you shadow? Did you actually spend time with the users, or did you do any, so you can do some quantitative research, look at numbers, look at systems, but have you spent time shadowing the clinicians or actually interacting with patients? And that's tough to do. And that empathy-based design, it's hard, so there's some frameworks, I think, as you guys all know, you're product developers, around user stories and making sure that you account for what the user needs. But I think that's a tricky thing to do, because often people have ideas, I know this will work, this has to work, but then you go off and build that thing and you spend 8 weeks and then you find out it doesn't work. Why? Because you didn't get that instant loop feedback right away. So finding people who have empathy, I think, is just as important and can, really advocate for the user without losing a sense of themselves. And that's a tricky thing.
As the whole kind of chief digital officer role has come to light, and probably still only a minority of health systems have this, relatively new role that you're in now at Catholic Health. I think we've seen folks come from many different backgrounds. So there's folks like yourselves, Michael, who have come from an incredible track record in healthcare and specifically in digital health. But we've seen some health systems bring on folks who've come from more traditional consumer companies, maybe folks who've led digital at large consumer brands and haven't come at all from healthcare. I'm kind of curious, do you have a take on sort of the pros and cons of how important it is to come from healthcare, or do you feel like maybe there's a fresh lens that folks who don't come from healthcare could maybe bring to this role? If you have any hot takes, love to hear them too.
It's interesting. I think first I'd say, there is definitely a craft knowledge to healthcare and working in the system. There's also an aspect of being in an industry too long and not seeing other lenses, right? So I think, first and foremost, I'd say smart people who have an open mindset and come in with humility and not just saying, well, this worked in pharma or this worked in, I'm in life sciences. That's a tricky thing, right? So I would say, play to the strengths. Some folks will come in and have a really strong background, but when you're in the CDIO role, I think it's more about the leadership you have, and not being the idea guy. So, and when things come up, if you do have that deep craft knowledge, you've probably already solved those puzzles before. That's where I'd say, as far as pros and cons, you're going to have an edge coming out of healthcare. You're going to have an edge coming out of other industry because you're going to bring a lot of the learnings here. So I'd say it's a really good mix. Depends on the person. It could be favorable or unfavorable, depending on that person, their mindset, and perhaps, some of their experience.
That's fair.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And actually, speaking about people from out of industry that are coming in and maybe trying to disrupt in a digital context, you actually wrote a recent LinkedIn post that I wanted to dig up. It was regarding big tech having challenges in healthcare. And you asked the question, why do the juggernauts keep failing in health tech? and went on to explain how disruption works so well in other tech verticals, but they had this very user-centric, customer-driven success. That healthcare has this twist, which we're kind of hinting at, where the consumer is only one part of the success. The winner has to find a balance between the EHR, the payer, the health system, clinicians, regulatory. Like, there's so many stakeholders involved. So I'm curious, how does this intricate balance between stakeholders, and sometimes they have different goals, how does that influence your decision making when it comes to innovation, building new products?
Well, it's tough. When I wrote that, it was, I think everyone loves to see success. Nobody wants to see any company go through something and not succeed. Everyone wants a success story. And I do think they're having successes, but I think that maybe their iteration is just so macro, so large that it's way more visible. I mean, if you look at even, product development I've done over the years, if you saw all the failures, and it was on, the front cover of a magazine or whatever, that's very, we see everything. So there are a couple of aspects and things to look out for. One of them, kind of like a completely different industry, is like, if you look at movies, right? You have some of these movies, it's going to be a blockbuster. They put in $100 million. Why didn't it work? Right? Sometimes the producers get overly engaged. Maybe the script is bad, right? So why doesn't just throwing money or a framework? I love thinking about this, like looking at different industries or even sports teams. I think at one point the New York Rangers had the best players, basically in the league, but they weren't winning. So that doesn't mean that you're going to win. So I guess, so let's unpack that. Why doesn't it work out? So I think a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, having the craft knowledge is super important, and making sure that you get those lenses. Sure, you'll have the clinicians in there, but do you have the product folks? This is rare. Do you have the product folks that are born out of healthcare? Do you have the user experience folks born out of healthcare? And, really the groups that are assembling a mix and having really that lens correction, and then coming in with a product, looking for a solution, it is usually not going to work. But if you can, it's very expensive to start from zero and iterate and fail forward and until you finally catch on to something. But that's sort of the right way, the scientific, method of getting things done. So I think making sure that you have those lenses, I think, is what I'd say would propel them forward, and not just bringing the big tech and the money and saying, we're going to do this because we want to, but really starting and iterating, and failing it forward.
I think, Michael, one of the things that you've touched on is it's so important, I think, particularly in healthcare, to fall in love with the problem as opposed to the solution. Because to your point, I mean, I've seen many cases where you have these really brilliant, AI scientists and experts in AI who say, hey, I'm an expert in AI. I'm going to come to healthcare and then just apply AI to everything and solve all these major healthcare problems. And we've seen that not work out in many cases, because to your point, it's so much more complicated. And if you fall in love with the solution, not the problem, when it gets hard, you're just going to give up, you're going to quit, you're going to move on to the next industry, the next problem. But if you're passionate about the problem space in healthcare, you're going to try to look for like the right solution from first principles, and not try to just, you have the hammer and everything's a nail, right? So I think you hit the nail on the head pretty well on that one.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. You see this often, and I'd have to say, having humility, right? So I think I mentioned I don't want to be the idea guy all the time, and that's usually like the glory, right? Oh, I thought of this. And that's what I think propels a lot of people forward. But if you work with a really good product team and they have candor, you're going to hear pretty quickly that you should have done your research, or what's your hypothesis. You have to give a hypothesis statement, and then maybe immediately temper that out with results, right? So I'd say, when those folks come in and try, come and do that big AI thing and why it doesn't work, they might not be having the humility needed to really love the problem versus what they think their solution or their ideas are going to bring to the table. And that, you have to, you catch yourself, you know what I mean? Look, sometimes you have the great ideas. That's great, but you have to catch yourself and say, what does the UX team think? What does the product team think? And what does the DevOps or the engineers think? And if you get them all together, then it's a much better, I think, solution, more viable.
Yeah, makes sense. So, Michael, you're now the first ever Chief Digital Innovation, or sorry, Chief Digital and Information Officer at Catholic Health. How do you define this role? Because it is relatively new to the industry, but also for Catholic Health. How do you define that role?
Well, I think first of all, our leadership here, Dr. O'Shaughnessy, our CEO, is very savvy. And that was part of the reason why I came here. I think really having that cultural recognition of what digital means is super, super powerful. So as far as how I'm defining it, I think of digital, there's tools, but I think of it more as a culture and way of working. And, what I'm doing, how I'm defining that role is really building the, agile design thinking mindset into all things we do. Whether that's infrastructure, DR, cyber, or Epic, or working with vendors on products to really think about outcomes, aligning on those, and how can we evolve in an iterative way. That to me is digital. That's, I think, bringing the digital, and of course you've got your engagement and your digital front door and all of the things that come with digital. But if you're going to have the 5-star best in class Amazon journey, or Uber or Delta, whatever it may be, you've got to have that framework in place. And that's, I think, really framework and culture is, I think, really how I do it.
How did you spend your first 90 days in the role? Because I'm assuming there's so many things you could do in 90 days. What did you
Yeah,
end up do?
I think I did what a lot of people do. You read those books, what to do in 90 days. And it was a little scary. Some of it was a little scary, and, boy, that 90 days goes by fast. I think, the first thing I did was relationship building and listening and having empathy, and not coming in. I had to tell myself, don't come in and say you know all the answers, because just because it works somewhere else doesn't mean it's going to work here. And then getting a lay of the land, understanding what are the problems to solve. And I'm also, I do a lot of art as a background, and I think a lot about painting pictures. And sometimes when I'm working on a piece, I might do sketches, and people look at the final piece, they don't see all the sketches that you did. So I did a lot of rough sketching of the problem statements, and exploring all of the areas of the EHR in those first 90 days that I was uncomfortable with, and exploring the areas I didn't have comfort in, learning as much as possible and asking for help. So Epic was incredibly valuable in, they have such a great program for getting you up to speed or telling you where you need to focus. So that was a really strategic partnership. And then, of course, vendors, working with my vendors, and then obviously the stakeholders, unpacking their problems, and, having to really figure out what's the high value, low complexity, what's the high value, high complexity that we might want to invest in. And then if you're really doing it at a macro level, you're understanding that complexity. What's our capacity to even deliver? Then first 90 days come up with a now, soon, later in all the areas. And honestly, that's going to be a constant journey of figuring out what we can actually do based on that roadmap, measurement, and framework.
Yeah, I love that. And you've hit on looking at different vendor relationships, going from NYU Langone, where you had such a large team of developers, you basically built everything in-house, all this innovation, where now you're at Catholic Health, where historically there's been less of a focus on internal development. How does that change your approach when you're considering this large, digital transformation?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a shift in how, so there's, I'd say, it's very refreshing. If I were to say one word, I love the engineers. I love the software and getting behind building things. And there really is something cathartic about, committing to code and seeing your own work play out, right? So it's almost like, maybe back to the art analogy, like you got to actually use a paintbrush versus describe people what the picture is that you want. So I think, when you look at it from a health system, right, it's very, the cost of doing business and iterating, that's a bet, right? So you're really placing a bet on the cost of those engineers, the cost of the product, the DevOps, the pipeline, and you're basically iterating with bets that it's going to work, and then sustaining that is expensive. So not only that, you've got your 24-hour DevOps, instrumentation and seeing how things are up or down and working. And well, my approach changed now. So I'm really sussing out the right partners to work with. And, that's, my lens is very different now. How well do they play with Epic? Are they additive? Are they complementary? Or are they competitive? And, I really have Epic at the core of my strategy, but also, what's their roadmap? And I do ask a question of all the vendors, and it's, I try and get behind, I want to meet the product team. I want to understand their happiness index. And you'll know, talking to them, are they doing things that they're forced to do? Or are they doing things because it's the right thing to do from a product perspective? That's awesome. And can they sustain the high talent developers long enough to keep that product going, so you don't buy something and then it's gone a year later? So I think it's changed how, obviously, I decide what we want to use, what tool in the toolkit we want to use. But there's a really nice aspect of being able to outsource that sort of development pipeline and not have to worry about, is it going to work or not? They've done it in 30 other places, these vendors, right? They're going to fail, let them fail, at other places, and then I can adopt what they're doing.
So, Michael, you're one of the few CDIOs I've met who actually comes from a technical background. I think most I've met don't come specifically from a technical background. So I was kind of curious, like, has that changed the way you think about how you've designed your teams or the complementary skill sets you look for to support, to kind of, I guess, complement your own versus other folks who may not come from a technical world, but are coming into this role?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about, I don't know, I guess it's like a chessboard, right? What is your piece? What's the movements that you can do for that particular piece? And if you look at, you can look at traditional org charts, and sort of seeing what you need. But I think where it's different from me is I have advantages in the sense that I can go deep on cyber, or I can go deep with a vendor and really understand, how it might play out. So that's an advantage. But I think, if I had spent time in other areas, maybe that would, so I think the different phenotypes all have their strengths and pros and cons. But I do think it, obviously, because it's me, I would say I have an edge, in really tempering a strategy. And again, there's going to be things that don't work out. But I think I'm coming from, deep understanding of what it takes to make these products, what it takes to integrate them. And then, I could really see early if they're failing or succeeding.
That's awesome. Maybe one last question, and I think for time's sake, we want to get into the lightning round. We've seen explosion, especially since COVID, of patient-facing innovations, whether it's chatbots, digital care journeys, remote patient monitoring, all kinds of things. What are you most excited about lately?
So there's some things that I guess exciting. There's things that I'm like deeply interested in. I guess everyone has their passions that they want to geek out about. One of the more mundane ones, I'd say, get out of the way first, is no passwords. If this really becomes a thing, I do think, there's no universal ID in healthcare. So that's kind of like one of those ineffable things that people don't really equate to the larger problem sets, right? Access, whether it's logging into your portal or just, the disambiguation of your patient data as who is this person? What is the data? So getting into things and passwords, big problem. Also, cyber, that relates to cybersecurity and a lot of the issues we're having there. So that I kind of am looking forward to seeing that change. You brought up chatbots. I do have an analogy, and maybe just because I'm out here in Long Island, if you go to the beach with a ham sandwich, what's going to happen? Seagulls are going to come around, right? Right now, as a CDIO, the amount of chatbot, AI, or digital front door companies out there, it's like seagulls, and it's hard. Yes, it's hard to like find the right one. There's so many, and they've got some really strong game coming in with the marketing but I do think that the industry I would consider, as far as chat goes, is still nascent. I think where it's complex in healthcare, and I think what's happening is people have this now instant, this instant, I need things, Amazon Prime, I can get something later. If they don't get an answer right away, but operationally speaking, it's hard to have, you can have the basic things like medication refills, or are you coming or not? You can have two-way texting. But if you look at chat evolution, it starts with one way, then it goes to two-way, then you get into NLP, right? And then, of course, what we were talking about earlier, you've got to think about regulatory and compliance, and then opting out. And then, okay, if you've got 4 platforms doing this, are you orchestrating all of those regulatory and compliance things across the house? Boy, it gets complicated. So that, I think the growth and evolution of that is really kind of, it's slow, because it's going to get complex. And then anyone who's in healthcare knows that navigating care isn't just, I need to see a surgeon. No, what if it's a generalist? What if they don't have that subspecialty? So there's a lot of data and sort of like fuzzy logic, if you will, that needs to go into these. So I do see it as it evolves, it's going to get better, and as we take it on, it'll get better. But I think you asked me what I'm excited about. I'd say the other things are, RPM, remote patient monitoring coupled with telehealth. Back to my story about my dad, I watched him struggle. I'll never forget when he got a straw to change a channel, how excited we were. So anytime you bring something to the family, to the home, and you stop them from schlepping to the hospital. Obviously, we want to reduce readmissions, but like the impact on a family and just what it does to the patient. So to me, keeping people from home, sending data back with remote patient monitoring, and having those telehealth visits excites me on a personal level and a technology level. And I think it'll change the game as it, I was reading about smart mirrors and smart toilets. This is maybe the future, I don't need a mirror to tell me how unhealthy I am. That's, mirror, mirror on the wall, no thanks. But, so I do think the RPM is very exciting. And look, we can't deny, this is used interchangeably, machine learning, AI, and RPA, the automation, really. And I think that the operative word there is automation. Looking at efficiencies, where can you take care of the mundane so that our staff and faculty or physicians can spend time with the patients and not dealing with, you look in revenue cycle, billing. These are exciting to me because there's so much waste. And if we can reduce that, it doesn't have to be that thing, it doesn't have to be that story, that everyone wants around, AI for care or for decision support. Sometimes you could save the hospital millions of dollars, and that's exciting to me. But of course, yeah, the AI, as it pertains to imaging and helping physicians, I think that's amazing. Yeah. And I look forward to that, and working with strong vendors in that area. And just last, you asked me what's exciting. It just popped in my brain. Seeing a new generation of product-oriented people that are coming out of healthcare versus coming into, I think, we're kind of at that point where product's about, 10 years old. You're seeing people that are, they go to startups mostly, but I do think there's a fresh batch of people emerging that are really going to change the game wherever they go. And that's kind of exciting.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alan.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say, like, such a comprehensive list of, well formulated. Here's the exciting parts of technology, but then here's the pitfalls that we're encountering today. I just think it's such a wise perspective.
Yeah, I love that you touched on even like patient identity management and how do we reduce friction to patients using the technology you want them to use. I mean, people just move on to the next cool, sexy innovation, but you're like, no, hold on, like, let's reduce friction to adoption. I love that.
Yeah. Well, look at the early phases of, remote patient monitoring, right? Okay, you send something home. then the patient's got to log into that, then they got to log into their portal, then, you know, poor grandma, she's got to deal with all these passwords, you know, oh boy, right?
Totally. Yeah. So Michael, let's flip over to the Fast 5 lightning round. This is basically 5 questions to get to know you better for our audience.
Okay.
First question that we have is, what is your favorite book or book you've gifted the most?
Can I split those in 2 answers?
Yeah.
All right. Most gifted is Crucial Conversations. I think it's a really good book on you know, really understanding how, you know, I think conflict's healthy in the workplace, right? But it's got to be the right conflict, and I think people need to learn how to have that conflict, and you know, it's hard. But as far as my favorite book, you know, I love Clavel's book, so I guess Shogun would be my favorite book.
Very cool. Question 2, who's a person, dead or alive, you'd love to meet?
Marcus Aurelius.
Nice.
You know, I read his memoirs. You know, I find him fascinating. You know, not just his quotes, but just sort of the whole ethos and everything. You know, warrior, emperor, stoic. I would just love to have a conversation with him. Maybe Miyamoto Musashi as well. I don't know. My laptop too. Like he's a samurai.
Yeah.
I found him fascinating as well.
Definitely. That's cool. Question 3, would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
Not read people's minds, because I don't want to know.
Quick.
I'd say it's got to be speed, because is it force mass times acceleration, right? So you're going to have super strength with super speed, right? So I just, you know, right. If you had healing on there, I would pick that. Just, you know, if you did have that on there.
That would be a fantastic skill. Awesome. Question 4, what is something in healthcare you believe that others might find insane?
The complexity. You know, when I talk to people about, I mean, look, you guys probably have this too. What do you do? I work in healthcare IT. Then they start asking you about what the latest Windows to get, you know, and I'm like, oh, that's great. I might know a little bit about there, but I don't think, you know, look, there hasn't been any movies, or maybe there's a couple of movies around startups, but boy, is healthcare complex. You know, digital health. I think Judy, the, you know, the head of Epic, had a really good T-shirt she wears. Health IT is harder than rocket science. I might be misquoting it, but she mentioned it at one of her conferences, and the shirt sold out in like 10 minutes.
That's awesome.
But you know, it is really complicated. So you know, that I would say that's what people would find the most insane.
Yeah, I always say, like, just spend one day in a hospital. It'll blow your mind if you haven't been in one.
It's nuts.
Yeah.
All right, Michael, last question that we have. This is a pandemic lockdown related question. What is one hobby or activity you've gotten into since the beginning of the pandemic?
Definitely. I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in 20 years, and I got pretty into it. And then I'd say walks in the woods with my wife, family. I mean, just love it. So that's my pandemic things that I think just changed the course of my life again. For doing them.
No, that's awesome. I know.
Are you a Bob Ross? Are you...
No, you know, well, who doesn't like Bob? How do you not like Bob Ross? Right. But I'm more of a you know, so I picked up watercolor because I can do it with my kids, but it's really kind of like the time. You can literally do a whole piece in an hour. And you know, I'm pretty messy. So if I did oil, forget it. I'd have nothing. I don't think I'd be allowed to live in the house. And then acrylics are expensive. So I just, you know, picked up and I YouTubed it. I mean, here I am YouTubing stuff. So
that's cool. Hey, so you're a Monet. That's awesome.
Yeah, maybe not as good, but you know.
That's so cool. Well, awesome. You know, Michael, just being mindful of your time, we'll wrap it here. But thanks again for coming on the show. Honestly, you've shared a lot with our audience, and I think just your perspectives on healthcare and especially digital health is just so unique, from being completely immersed basically from the beginning of digital health in healthcare. So it's been really awesome to have you on the show. That's a wrap for this episode of The Digital Patient, hosted by Seamless MD. You can follow us on Twitter at Seamless MD. And if you like the podcast and you want to learn more, visit www.seamless.md. Michael, again, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.